right, diving in today. And I'm really excited about this. And we're going deep on emotions, folks. Specifically, we're going to be unpacking this book, Emotional Intelligence. It's got psychology, neuroscience, real-life stories, the whole shebang.
Yeah, it's quite a journey this book takes you on. Really makes you think about how much we don't realize about our own feelings.
Exactly. And that's kind of the mission here, right? To figure out what emotions actually are, like how do they work, why are they so powerful, and most importantly, what can we learn from all this research to, actually navigate our own emotions better?
I mean, think about it, right? We're often told to be rational, logical. Like emotions are these things to be controlled, suppressed even.
Right, like they're the enemy of good decision making.
But this book, it really paints a different picture. It's not about reason versus emotion. It's more like they're these two systems that are constantly interacting.
Yeah, like they're in a constant dance influencing each other all the time.
And that's what makes it so fascinating, right? Like, how many times have you known what the logical choice was, but your gut feeling was screaming something completely different?
Oh, all the time, all the time. It's like that internal struggle trying to figure out who to listen to, the head or the heart.
And sometimes the heart wins, and sometimes it's not even a choice, like it just takes over completely.
That's a great point. The book actually gives this really powerful example talking about a parent's instinct to protect their child. Like, logically, self-preservation is supposed to be our strongest drive, right?
Right, survival of the fittest and all that.
But in those critical moments, like if a child is in danger, a parent often just acts, no hesitation, putting themselves in harm's way without even thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, from a purely rational perspective, that kind of self-sacrifice just doesn't make sense. But when you look at it through the lens of emotion,
Hmm.
love, that deep bond, it's like there wasn't even a choice to be made.
Right, it's instinctual. And the book argues that this is a really fundamental part of who we are, even as a species. These deep feelings, they're wired into us. It's our evolutionary heritage.
Yeah, it makes you realize that our emotions, they're not some new invention. This system, it's been shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution.
So basically, we're walking around with ancient emotional hardware in a super modern world.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why those primal emotions can feel so overwhelming sometimes, right? Like they can kind of hijack our more recently developed rational minds.
Absolutely. It's like our brains are still catching up to the crazy pace of change in our societies and technology.
And the book actually shares a personal story that I think really illustrates this whole idea of the protective function of emotions, and it's pretty incredible.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one. The author was driving, right? And a snowstorm just hits out of nowhere.
Yeah, a heavy snowstorm. They felt this urge to keep going, but then a wave of fear just kind of washed over them, made them pull over.
And thank goodness they did, right?
Totally. Moments later, they saw that there'd been this huge accident just ahead, completely blocked the highway. It's like their fear was literally a lifesaver.
It really makes you think about how often we ignore those gut feelings. I mean, this could be any of us, right?
Absolutely. Our emotions, they're not always pleasant, but they're often trying to tell us something really important, like that rabbit freezing in terror. Sometimes fear is the smartest thing you can feel.
So this brings us to the amygdala. The book kind of paints it as like the brain's alarm system, right? Always scanning for danger.
Exactly. It's this little almond-shaped structure deep in the brain, and it's constantly on the lookout for anything that might be a threat.
So when it spots something that seems dangerous, what happens then?
Oh, it doesn't mess around. It sends out these super fast signals to pretty much every part of the brain, setting off this whole cascade of reactions.
So like the fight or flight response?
Exactly. It's like your body going into emergency mode, prepping you to either fight the threat or run like hell. Heart rate goes up, muscles tense, hormones surge. It's a whole body takeover.
Wow. And this is where the research of Joseph Ledoux comes in, right? The
Yeah.
book talks about how he kind of revolutionized our understanding of this whole process.
Yeah, Ledoux is brilliant. What he discovered was that there are actually neural pathways for emotions that bypass the neocortex.
Hold on, the neocortex, that's like the thinking part of our brain, right?
Exactly, the more recently evolved part where all that complex reasoning and planning happens. But Ledoux found these sort of back alleys in the brain, these direct routes from the thalamus, which is like the sensory relay station, straight to the amygdala.
So basically, you can have an emotional reaction to something before you even consciously process what it is.
Precisely. It's like your emotional brain is getting a head start, triggering that fight or flight response before your thinking brain has even fully grasped the situation.
That's pretty wild when you think about it.
Oh, totally. And Ledoux actually showed this really clearly in his experiments with rats.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. What did he do with the rats?
So he did damage the auditory cortex in these rats, the part of the brain that processes sound. And then he paired a specific tone with a mild electric shock repeatedly.
So the rats couldn't actually hear the tone anymore.
Nope, not consciously. But here's the thing, they still learned to fear it. Even though their auditory cortex was damaged, the sound information was still reaching the thalamus and then taking that direct route to the amygdala, bypassing the damaged cortex completely.
So they're having this whole fear response to a sound they can't even hear.
Exactly. It proved that the amygdala was learning and reacting independently of those higher thinking areas. Pretty amazing, right?
Totally changes how you think about your own emotions.
It makes you realize just how powerful and, in a way, autonomous that emotional part of your brain can be. And it kind of helps explain why sometimes it feels like our emotions are just in this constant tug of war with our thoughts.
Right, like there are these two forces battling for control.
And the connections between the amygdala and the neocortex, those are really at the heart of that dynamic.
Okay, so how does that actually play out, like in your everyday life? How do feelings and thoughts influence each other?
Well, one really important way is that your emotions are actually crucial for effective thinking.
Really?
Yeah, not just in the sense of making good decisions, which we'll get to later, but even just being able to think clearly in the first place.
Interesting.
Think about it, right? When you're super upset about something, it's almost impossible to concentrate to make good decisions.
Or tell me about it. When I'm stressed, my brain just turns to mush. What's happening there?
Well, strong emotions like anxiety, intense anger, they can create this kind of neural static that interferes with the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, it's a part of the brain right behind your forehead,
Yeah.
and it's crucial for what's called working memory. It's like your brain's mental workspace where you hold and process information.
Okay, got it.
And when you're flooded with emotional signals from the limbic system, the amygdala, and all that, it basically sabotages the prefrontal cortex's ability to do its job.
So you can't think straight because your emotions are drowning out your thoughts.
Exactly.
Makes you wonder about, like, kids who are going through a lot of emotional stuff, right? Could that actually be hurting their ability to learn?
Absolutely. It's something that often gets overlooked, but those kinds of chronic emotional difficulties, they can definitely have a negative impact on intellectual development.
And they might not even show up on those standard IQ tests, right?
Right, because those tests are really focused on more traditional academic skills. But you can see these problems when you do more specific assessments that look at frontal lobe functioning. There are kids with really high IQs who still struggle in school, often because they have trouble controlling their impulses, they're anxious, their behavior is disruptive.
So their emotional challenges are holding them back despite their intellectual potential.
Exactly. And this really makes you question our obsession with IQ, doesn't it? Like we put so much emphasis on it, but what about all these crucial emotional skills that are clearly so vital for success, for happiness?
Yeah, good point. It's like we're missing a big piece of the puzzle when we just focus on IQ.
And the book actually points to this really interesting study that followed a group of Harvard students from the 1940s all the way into middle age.
Harvard students. You'd think they'd be set for life.
Right. But what they found was that the guys with the highest college test scores, they weren't necessarily the most successful in their careers later on.
Really?
Yeah. And they didn't report being any happier in their personal lives either.
So smarts alone don't guarantee a fulfilling life. Big surprise.
Right. And Karen Arnold, an education professor who studied valedictorians, put it really well. She said they're amazing at achieving within the system, getting those grades, but life throws curveballs that grades don't prepare you for.
Totally. It's like you can ace all the tests, but that doesn't mean you're equipped to deal with the emotional ups and downs of life.
Exactly.
And that's where this idea of emotional intelligence comes in, right?
Yes. It's this whole set of skills or even traits that are often overlooked, but they're so essential for your well-being, for how your life ultimately turns out.
It's like you can be book smart, but how people smart are you? Can you understand and manage your own emotions? Can you read other people? Can you build strong relationships?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that your emotional life is just as important as your intellectual life, and it's something you can actually develop, like a skill.
Okay, I like that. So it's not like you're stuck with whatever emotional abilities you're born with. You can actually learn and grow in this area.
Absolutely. And the level of skill you develop in these areas, it's a huge predictor of how well you'll do in life, in your relationships, your career, everything.
I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. Like emotional aptitude is a meta skill, right? It
Oh,
influences how effectively you can use all your other abilities.
couldn't have said it better myself. And it's interesting, the book touches on Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which kind of ties into all this.
Oh yeah, Gardner, he argued that there's not just one kind of intelligence, right?
Exactly. He proposed this whole spectrum of intelligences, going beyond just the typical verbal and math skills.
Right, like you'd have spatial intelligence, musical intelligence.
Exactly. He also talked about personal intelligences, which is really where the emotional stuff comes in.
Okay, break that down for me. What are personal intelligence?
So there's interpersonal intelligence, which is your ability to understand other people, their moods, motivations, desires, basically how good you are at reading people and interacting with them.
Like being a good therapist
Yeah,
or a leader who can really inspire people.
exactly. And then there's intrapersonal intelligence, which is all about knowing yourself, your own feelings, your strengths and weaknesses.
So self-awareness, basically.
Yes, being in touch with your inner world. But the book makes an interesting point that while Gardner's model is great, it maybe doesn't go quite deep enough into the role of emotions.
What do you mean?
Well, Gardner comes from a very cognitive perspective, so he focuses a lot on understanding motives, habits. But emotions, they're not always so easily captured by just thinking about them?
Right, there's that feeling component that goes beyond just thinking.
Exactly.
So to really get a handle on this whole emotional intelligence thing, the book lays out its own framework, right? The 5 domains of emotional intelligence.
Yes. It's a really helpful way to break it down.
All right, hit me with it. What are the 5 domains?
Okay, so first, there's knowing your emotions, which is all about self-awareness. Second is managing emotions. Third is motivating yourself, which includes things like self-control and this idea of flow, which we'll talk about. Fourth is recognizing emotions in others, which is empathy. And fifth is handling relationships, which they call social competence.
All right, let's unpack those one by one. Starting with self-awareness. It sounds simple enough, but I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, for sure. It's not just about feeling an emotion, it's about recognizing it, being able to name it.
So like instead of just feeling crappy, you can actually say, okay, this is sadness I'm feeling, or this is anger.
Exactly. And the book uses this great analogy from William James, the psychologist. He talked about experiencing depression and feeling like there was this second self, almost like an observer, who was watching him go through it.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful image.
It is, right? It's like having that little bit of distance, that meta-awareness, even when you're in the thick of it emotionally. And the book suggests that this is actually a sign that certain parts of your neocortex are actively monitoring the emotion, which is the first step to gaining control over it.
So self-awareness is like the foundation of everything else.
Totally. It's the bedrock emotional competence.
But what about people who just don't seem to be aware of their own feelings?
Mm.
The book mentions this thing called alexithymia, right?
Yes, alexithymia. It's a fascinating and sometimes very challenging condition. It literally means having no words for emotions.
So they just don't have language to describe what they're feeling.
It's more than that. They might not even be consciously aware of their feelings in the first place. The book gives some really interesting examples, like this guy, Gary, who told his therapist that he just didn't know what he felt. No anger, no sadness, no real joy.
Wow, that's tough.
Yeah, he came across as really bland, unemotional. And then there's another example of this woman who cried during a movie but couldn't explain why. She just said she felt awful, but she couldn't pinpoint any specific emotion.
So it's like they're missing that crucial link between their internal experience and their ability to actually understand and express it.
Exactly. And it can make it really hard for them to navigate relationships, make decisions, all sorts of things.
This really drives home how important self-awareness is. Like, you can't manage your emotions if you don't even know what you're feeling.
Totally. And then there's this other really fascinating case, Elliot, which the book uses to show just how crucial emotions are in even our most rational decision-making.
Oh yeah, Elliot's story is a wild one. Remind me what happened to him.
So Elliot had brain surgery to remove a tumor. And the surgery itself was a success, but afterwards,
Something was different.
yeah, really different. He was this successful lawyer before, but afterwards he couldn't hold down a job, his marriage fell apart, he made all these terrible financial decisions. It was like his life completely unraveled.
And what did the doctors figure out?
The surgery, while removing the tumor, also damaged his ability to experience emotion.
He couldn't feel emotions at all.
Nope.
Huh?
His IQ was fine, his logic was fine, but he couldn't feel anything.
Yeah.
And because of that, he couldn't make good decisions anymore.
Wow, so it's like he knew what he should do, logically, but he didn't have those gut feelings to guide him.
Exactly. It's a really powerful case for how emotions aren't just these fluffy, unimportant things. They actually play this vital role in even our most rational thought processes.
So it's not about suppressing your emotions, it's about finding that balance.
Exactly. You need emotions, but they need to be the right intensity and duration appropriate to the situation.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
The book also dives into specific emotions, right? It talks about how there are actually different types of anger.
Yes, that's a really important distinction. You have that kind of sudden explosive rage that's triggered by an immediate threat, which is probably coming from the amygdala.
Like road rage.
Exactly. But then there's also this more calculated, simmering anger that you might feel, like outrage at an injustice or even a desire for revenge.
So that's more of a neocortex thing.
Right. And anger, it can be tricky to manage because unlike sadness, which tends to make you withdraw, anger can be energizing.
Yeah, you get that adrenaline rush.
Exactly. It can make you feel powerful, even righteous, which can be kind of seductive. The book actually talks about Dolph Zillman's research on this, what he called the rage rush.
Okay, tell me about this rage rush.
Right.
What did Zillman find?
So one of the things he found was that anger is often triggered by this feeling of being endangered. But it's not just about physical threats. It can be a threat to your ego, your self-esteem, like feeling insulted or unjustly treated.
So it's like our primal brain is still reacting as if our social standing is a matter of life or death.
Precisely. And when you feel threatened like that, your limbic system kicks into gear, releasing these hormones, catecholamines, that give you that burst of energy, getting you ready to fight or flee.
So given all that, how do you actually manage anger? Like, what are some concrete things you can do?
Well, Zillman's suggested a couple of key approaches. One is to challenge those anger-triggering thoughts early on before they really take hold. Reevaluating the situation, trying to see it from a different angle, that can help to de-escalate things.
So it's about catching it early and basically talking yourself down from that ledge.
Exactly. The other approach is to do something that's incompatible with feeling angry. Like if you can shift your focus, engage in a completely different activity, that can help too.
So like instead of yelling at your spouse, you go for a run.
Exactly. Anything that helps you shift gears both mentally and physically. And the book actually has this great example of how just understanding someone's situation can completely change your anger response. It talks about an experiment where people were intentionally provoked by a rude assistant.
Okay, what happened?
So afterwards, they were given a chance to retaliate, and most of them did, pretty enthusiastically.
I bet.
But in one version of the experiment, they told the participants that the assistant was actually under a ton of pressure, really stressed about some upcoming exams, and just knowing that, it completely changed their response.
No way, they didn't retaliate.
Nope. Instead of being angry, they felt compassion for the guy.
Yeah.
It's amazing how just a little bit of context can shift your whole emotional experience.
It's like that saying, be kind, everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. All right, let's move on to worry. I feel like a lot of people struggle with this, right? Just that constant, low-grade anxiety about the future.
Oh, absolutely. Worry is a huge problem for a lot of folks. And the book talks about Robert Borkowicz's perspective on this, which is really interesting.
What's Borkowicz's take?
He thinks that chronic worry actually stems from low-level activity in the amygdala.
So that alarm system is kind of always buzzing in the background.
Exactly. And he suggests that for some people, worry is actually a way of trying to cope with potential threats. It's like they're mentally rehearsing all these bad things that might happen.
But isn't that kind of counterproductive? Like, you're just making yourself more anxious.
That's the irony. Worry doesn't actually lead to solutions, it just keeps you stuck in this cycle of fear. And the book points out that simply telling someone to stop worrying doesn't help.
Yeah, no kidding. If it were that easy, no one would worry in the first place.
Exactly. But Borkowic does offer a first step that can be really helpful, and that's developing self-awareness around your worry.
Okay, how do you do that?
It's about learning to recognize the early signs of worry, those triggers that set it off, like what are the situations that tend to make you worry? What kinds of thoughts pop into your head? What does it feel like in your body when you start to worry?
So it's about tuning in to those subtle cues.
Precisely. The more aware you are of those early warning signs, the better chance you have of interrupting the cycle before it spirals out of control.
Makes sense. What about dealing with sadness? Like not clinical depression, but just those times when you feel kind of down or melancholy.
Yeah, those everyday blues. The book actually talks about how some of the ways we typically deal with sadness can backfire.
Oh, like what?
Well, one common response is to isolate yourself, right? Just withdraw and kind of wallow in it.
Yeah, guilty as charged.
But the problem is that can just make you feel more lonely and isolated in the long run.
So socializing is the answer.
It depends. Socializing can be helpful if it distracts you from those sad thoughts. But if the conversation keeps circling back to the source of your sadness, it can just make things worse.
So it's about finding those people and activities that genuinely lift your spirits.
Exactly. And even trying to distract yourself from deeper feelings of depression can be tricky. The book mentions this research by Wenslaff that showed that people prone to depression sometimes use other distressing thoughts as distractions.
Wait, so they're trying to distract themselves from feeling bad by thinking about other bad things.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's like their brains are wired to associate bad moods with more bad thoughts, so they end up just reinforcing that negative cycle.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is, right. It really shows how complex our emotional lives can be.
Definitely. Okay, the book also touches on this idea of unflappability. Like, there are some people who just seem to be consistently positive and resilient no matter what life throws at them. What's the secret?
I wish I knew. But seriously, there's some interesting research on this by a guy named Richard Davidson. He studied people who are just naturally upbeat, and he found that they tend to have more activity in the left prefrontal lobe of their brain.
The left prefrontal lobe. What's special about that?
Well, it's generally associated with positive feelings, with approach behaviors. It's like the feel-good center of the brain.
So these unflappable people, they basically have brains that are wired for happiness.
It seems like it. Davidson even called it upbeat denial, like their brains are kind of filtering out the negative
Right.
stuff. But he also noted that there might be a downside to this, like maybe they're not as self-aware because they're not really confronting those negative emotions.
Interesting. So it's like maybe a little bit of negativity is actually healthy.
Could be. It's all
Huh.
about balance, right?
Always is. All right, let's move on to the third domain, which is all about motivating yourself. The book opens this section with the author talking about completely freezing up during a calculus exam.
Yeah, I remember that. Pretty relatable, right? We've all been there, that feeling of just being paralyzed by fear.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like your brain just shuts down. And the book uses this to introduce the importance of impulse control and delayed gratification.
And that brings us to the classic marshmallow experiment, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the marshmallows. Remind me how that worked again.
So they'd give these little kids a choice. One marshmallow now, or two marshmallows if they could wait a few minutes. And what they found was that the kids who could delay gratification, they ended up being more successful in all these different areas of their lives.
Really? Just from resisting a marshmallow.
It's amazing, right? They were more socially competent, more resilient, more self-reliant. Even years later, they were still better at delaying gratification and pursuing long-term goals.
That's pretty incredible. It's like that one little choice reveals something really fundamental about your ability to manage your impulses and your emotions.
Totally.
The book also talks about how anxiety can actually undermine your intellectual abilities, and it's not just about feeling bad.
Right. It's like worry actually interferes with your ability to think clearly.
Makes sense. It's hard to focus when you're all stressed out. The book uses the example of air traffic controllers.
Yeah, they have to manage so much information under so much pressure. If their working memory is compromised by anxiety, it can be disastrous.
And when it comes to test anxiety specifically, the book points out that there are actually two different types of anxious students.
Yes, this is something that often gets overlooked. Some students, the anxiety actually helps them. It motivates them to study harder, and that adrenaline rush helps them focus during the test.
So for them, a little bit of anxiety is a good thing.
Exactly. But then there are other students where the anxiety completely sabotages their performance. They can't think straight, they can't remember things. It backfires completely.
And it's kind of ironic, right? Because they're probably the ones who are trying the hardest to do well.
Absolutely. It just shows you how different people respond to stress and pressure.
Hmm.
And on the flip side of that, the book talks about how positive emotions can actually enhance your cognitive abilities.
Yeah, like when you're in a good mood, problems seem easier to solve. What's going on there?
Well, it seems like positive emotions actually broaden your thinking, make you more flexible and creative. You're more likely to see connections between different ideas to come up with novel solutions.
So maybe we should all be telling more jokes.
Right, lighten the mood, get those creative juices flowing.
I'm all for it. Okay, the book also talks about optimism and hope, which are obviously pretty important for staying motivated. How do they define those concepts?
So optimism and hope, too, are basically about having this expectation that things will generally turn out okay, even when you face setbacks.
So it's not about being delusional. It's about having a realistic but positive outlook.
Exactly. And the book talks about Martin Seligman's research on this, which is really fascinating.
Oh, Seligman's the guy who studied learned helplessness, right? But he also did a lot of work on optimism.
Right. And one of the things he found is that optimists and pessimists actually explain their successes and failures in very different ways.
How so?
Optimists tend to attribute their failures to external factors, things that are changeable, so they're more likely to bounce back and try again. Pessimists, on the other hand, they blame their failures on their own personal shortcomings.
So they're more likely to just give up.
Exactly. They feel helpless to change things. And the book actually gives a really cool example of the power of optimism from Seligman's work at MetLife.
MetLife, the insurance company.
Yeah. He convinced them to hire a group of salespeople who scored really high on optimism, even though they didn't quite meet their usual hiring criteria.
So they were taking a chance on these guys.
Totally. And it paid off big time. Those optimistic salespeople, they outsold everyone else by a huge margin.
That's impressive.
It's because they didn't take rejection personally. They saw it as a temporary setback, so they just kept going.
So optimism is more than just a feel-good attitude. It can actually translate into real-world success.
Absolutely. And then there's this other really interesting concept that the book dives into, this idea of flow.
Flow, yeah. I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not totally clear on what it means.
It's basically that state of complete absorption in an activity where you're totally engaged, you're enjoying it, and you're performing at your best.
So like being in the zone.
Exactly. And the researcher who really pioneered this work is a guy named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi.
Csikszentmihalyi, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But his work is really important. He found that flow happens when you're doing something that's challenging enough to keep you engaged, but not so challenging that you get overwhelmed.
So it's that sweet spot between boredom and anxiety.
Exactly. And when you're in flow, you kind of lose track of time. You're not really thinking about yourself. You're just completely immersed in the activity.
Sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you get into this flow state?
Well, Csikszentmihalyi emphasized the importance of intrinsic motivation. It's about wanting to do something for its own sake, not for some external reward.
So like you're playing the piano because you love it, not because you're trying to win a competition.
Exactly. And the book actually connects flow to learning, too. Students who experience flow while studying tend to perform better, regardless of their IQ.
Makes sense. If you're enjoying the process, you're going to learn more. And they actually found this with the top performers at Bell Labs, too, right?
Yes. Those guys, they weren't necessarily the smartest people in the traditional sense, but they were incredibly self-motivated, and they were masters of their social networks. It was their emotional intelligence that set them apart.
That's a good reminder that success is about more than just brains. It's about how you use them.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to the fourth domain, recognizing emotions in others, or empathy. The book describes this as a really fundamental people skill. And it argues that it's actually rooted in your own self-awareness.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? You can't really understand how someone else is feeling if you don't have a good grasp of your own emotional landscape.
So empathy is not just about being nice, it's about having that deeper understanding of what's going on inside another person.
Exactly. And it's crucial in so many areas of life, from your personal relationships to your work life. I mean, think about it, right? Good salespeople, good leaders, they're all highly attuned to the emotions of the people they're dealing with.
And the lack of empathy, like in psychopaths, can have pretty devastating consequences.